Hi, everybody. This is Lori Ayers. Welcome back to Everything Women's Wrestling. This is episode 8, and today we are joined by Afsoon Johnston and Olivia Lichti. And really, the name of the game with the conversation today is let's get talking about women's wrestling. There has been a book that was recently published about 2 years ago. It was actually put out called Afsoon, written by Craig Sesker. And Afsoon gets on and talks about the book today. And Olivia Lichti joins us because she put together a book guide for the book that really is going to get our wrestling community talking. And so we talk all about the sequence and the scope of the book. We talk about all of the great questions that are included in the guide that are going to generate such great conversations within our little wrestling corners of the world. And all the information on how to access the book guide, how to purchase the book is included in the show, as well as who the book guide is for and who would be interested or who the book would be applicable to. So you want to check out the show. It's something that you can share with your wrestling communities. It's not just a book for female wrestlers. It's a book for everyone. We can all learn and grow from it and begin to have some of these really important conversations. So don't miss the episode and make sure that you go to the website, purchase the book, and download the book guide. All right, so excited to have some amazing guests on the Everything Women's Wrestling show today. So Afsoon Johnston and Olivia Lichti are here, and we have a cool project to share with our Everything Women's Wrestling audience. So I'm going to let them talk really quickly here, but just to let our audience know, we are going to be talking about Afsoon Johnston's book, Afsoon, written by Craig Sesker. And the book came out a few years ago, but we're going to dive into a book guide that Olivia helped us put together during our show today. We'll talk a little bit more about it. But to give some background about my two guests today, we're actually going to start off with their wrestling journeys. So we have some wrestling royalty really with us today with Afsoon Johnston. So I'm going to pose a question right away to you, Afsoon. Welcome to the Everything Women's Wrestling show. And if you don't mind, we would just love to hear whatever you're willing to share about your path in wrestling.
Absolutely. Lori, thank you so much for having me on today. I'm excited to be here to talk and share a little bit about my journey and about my wrestling history. I am one of the pioneers of women's wrestling. I was there from the very, very start when there was no women's wrestling, and then there was. So the very first world team for the United States, and at the very beginning of how women's wrestling got started here in the United States.
And so, I mean, that was in 1989, right, Afsoon? So
Right. And a little bit about my wrestling journey. Back in the 80s, there really weren't that many girls wrestling, maybe a handful in the entire country. And, it was right after Title IX had come into effect. And so legally, they couldn't tell us girls, no, you can't wrestle on a boys' high school team. And so for myself in the state of California and where I was going to high school, I went out to my high school coach, and we had a very, very successful boys high school wrestling program. And wrestling was something that I loved and I wanted to be a part of. And so I, approached the head coach and I said, I want to be on the wrestling team. And he took one look at me and said, legally I can't stop you, but this is boys wrestling. And again, there weren't girls wrestling. And so I had to, convince him that I was really there for the right reasons, that I loved the sport of wrestling and that I wanted the opportunity, same as any boy, to go out for the team and have the opportunity to experience high school wrestling. And again, because of Title IX at that time, legally he couldn't stop me. So he wasn't very happy because it just wasn't a thing back then, right, for girls to be wrestling. And but that's how I was able to get on the boys wrestling team and really compete only against boys at that time. Again, because there was no opportunity for girls wrestling, and there were no girls wrestling teams, and And so that's how it first all got started. And that was in 1989 when um, finally the United States organized its very first women's national team and brought the handful of girls that were wrestling within the United States all together under one tournament. And it was the first time really that I had seen other female wrestlers kind of doing the same thing that I was doing. They were wrestling at their boys' high school wrestling teams throughout the country. And so all of us were brought to one place, to one tournament, and the United States held its very first women's kind of national wrestling tournament, which then formed the very first team that the United States was able to send over to the World Championships. In 1989 was the first year that they had the World Championships, including women.
Wow. And so it is crazy to think back, though. And Olivia, it's kind of neat to have both you and Afsoon because, you're this next generation. You certainly, are just graduated high school. You're up in Canada now. You're probably one of the most informed reporters of women's and international wrestling. So for you to be on a call and listening to Afsoon talk about this story about the first team, that's so cool. So I love, and I can't wait to hear about your kind of, journey and entry into the sport of wrestling. So Afsoon, how did that feel? I mean, so you said like, you really hadn't been exposed to women's wrestling before, to girls wrestling. You were doing this almost in a vacuum, like by yourself on this boys team. And how did that feel the first time you saw other female wrestlers at that event?
Yeah, exactly. Because just like you said, Lori, I felt like I was in a vacuum. I wasn't really even aware that other girls were doing what I was doing. I had grown up in my childhood in Iran, and my father was a wrestler. And so he had kind of taken me under his wing in our house and taught me wrestling technique. But again, it was that vacuum that was, my father teaching me wrestling moves, which I didn't think anybody else did. And I know for a fact no one else in Iran at that time, no other girls were experiencing what I was wrestling and being taught wrestling moves. And so then moving to United States and wrestling on a boys team, again, I wasn't aware that there were any other girls wrestling or doing that. And so it was really crazy for me. It was like going from one day of being this girl kind of being looked at as a freak show or as a sideshow, or what is she thinking or what is she doing? Because there was so much negativity and criticism from the general public and from the wrestling community really at that time, that girls shouldn't be wrestling, and what does this girl think she's doing, and why is she out there rolling around with the boys? And unfortunately, that was the mindset. It wasn't very supportive of, oh, look, there's a girl. And, until they kind of watched some of my matches and went, oh, I guess she knows how to wrestle and she looks like a wrestler out there, But really, their first idea of a girl being on a wrestling mat, they looked at as a side show or as a joke, or what is she crazy? What does she think she's doing? And so at that time, I felt like I always had to defend myself or actually, do the best I could in wrestling to convince people, really, I'm out there for the sport and I love wrestling. And just because I'm a girl, it shouldn't be stopping me from enjoying this sport. And so then from going from that to all of a sudden, there were other girls doing what I was doing. It felt like, okay, well, maybe I'm not crazy. And maybe all this criticism that I've been taking and all these naysayers, maybe they're the ones that are wrong. And maybe what I am doing is actually the right thing, that girls could wrestle and should have that opportunity. So it finally gave it some legitimacy, okay, I'm not the crazy one here, and the sport really could be for girls.
And honestly, it's amazing to me how persistent you were, Afsoon, because, in your story, it talks about obviously your childhood. You spent much of your childhood in Iran, a country that was more forward thinking until the revolution. And then afterward, you found yourself living and your family living in a place where women were certainly not supported in a sport like wrestling, right? So tell us a little bit about that.
Right, right, exactly. I would say I probably have experienced the extremes, right? I lived in a country where women were really considered second class citizens. Women didn't have the same rights as men. It was really extreme. You've heard some stories about how women are treated in Afghanistan. Well, that's how women were also treated in Iran after the revolution. And so, being at that young age during that time in Iran, my parents knew, being a girl and being their only child, being a girl, that wasn't an environment that I would have a future, that I would be able to thrive and really have the same opportunities as if they were had to have had a son, and so leaving that environment, going from that extreme of not having any rights just for the fact that I'm a girl, I was born female, and then coming to the United States and having it be the land of opportunity, where there's still a lot that's not equal, and there's still ways that we need to fight for equality. But at least there was opportunities, and these discussions were being had, and I was able for myself to find that. Uh, Kind of that niche with me was wrestling, to be able to express myself, and that legally no one was going to be able to stop me and say, no, you can't do that. And, here in Iran, women were getting stoned and get to death, and were being, tortured, and just horrible, horrible things. Whereas, at least in the United States, maybe it wasn't so much accepted initially, but there was opportunity there, and there's discussions to be had, and that we were moving forward with opening up our minds, and having more opportunities for women to be equal in men in, whether it was work or, for me, wrestling.
Right. Oh my gosh. And it certainly sounds like your path had a lot of resistance. I can relate, just having been experiencing, having experienced the sport of wrestling through my daughter. Hopefully, Olivia, you didn't experience as much adversity as Afsoon has getting into the sport of wrestling in Canada. But fill us in a little bit about, this is going to be very paradoxical, right? Hopefully, in some regards. But fill us in a bit about your experience in Canada and your journey in wrestling so far.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely is very contrasting to Afsoon's story, but I'm 18 years old. I'm from a really small town in Ontario, Canada, just a few hours away from the American border. And like most Canadian kids, I grew up playing hockey. And then in high school, I was introduced to the sport through my gym teacher. She didn't really suggest it. She more told me that I was going to go out for the wrestling team. And she was a kind of an intimidating lady, so I just went for it. I went out for the team, and I really wasn't expecting much, but I kind of fell in love with it. And then by the end of the year, I had committed myself fully to wrestling. I quit hockey, and I began to train at a club outside my school, as well as on my high school team. And from there, I was given so many opportunities. I'm really lucky that in Canada, women's wrestling is equally as big, if not bigger, than men's wrestling. So I've had lots of chances to travel to different events and train in different rooms and stuff like that, which I'm super grateful for. And then I'm also super lucky that one of my coaches, Coach Gary Bird, is a referee for United World Wrestling. He's on the International Referees Commission, and he's done events like the World Championships, the Olympic Games, tons of big international tournaments. So he brought a really unique perspective to my wrestling room, and he, along with all my other coaches, really pushed me to watch international wrestling, just from the standpoint of adding to my wrestling style and seeing the ceiling of where I could go in the sport. So I took that seriously, and I began watching a ton of international wrestling, and I really fell in love with the different storylines and the synchronicity between countries at these events. And from there, I wake up at 4 a.m. to watch all the crazy tournaments in Europe and stuff like that. And now I've had opportunities to work on projects like this and write with Flow. So I'm really just hoping to share my passion for the sport with other people and make it easier for others to follow international women's wrestling, because there's so many amazing individuals with stories to be heard.
Well, you are doing just that. I mean, just reading your articles, I am in awe of your knowledge of what's going on internationally. So it's a perfect example of someone inspiring someone else to like challenge themselves to reach out. You said that your coach, right, was involved in encouraging you to do that. So it certainly sounds like there are opposing stories here, storylines going on, but interesting, right? That we can all work together on the project that we put together for Afsoon's book. So Afsoon, if you wouldn't mind, we're going to jump into a little bit of the work that we've all done together here, but can you tell us a little bit more about the scope and sequence of the book and what it includes?
Yes, absolutely. The book it has a lot of different aspects to it. And we wrote it in a way that it would be appealing to all audiences that, hopefully young girls can pick up the book and, uh, be inspired, and also for the general public to be exposed to the sport of wrestling. Um, it has, of course, it's a wrestling story, but it's also a little bit about the story of my life. And it starts with my early childhood years and being born in Iran and the experiences in Iran that I touched on a little bit, as far as what women, went through during those years in Iran, being women, and some of my personal experiences, which I think as you read through the chapters, it just sounds so unreal that some of those stories and some of those events could have taken place. So it's definitely a very interesting, fast read through the childhood years, and then how I found the sport of wrestling, and some funny stories how when I first went out for the sport of wrestling, and then it chronicles all the way through my journey with the sport of wrestling into the world championship and elite level, and then finally concluding with kind of my personal life, and how wrestling brought me successes in my personal life, and ending with the Olympics, and with me coaching the 2016 Rio Olympics.
It really is quite a journey. In the book, it does highlight, and I felt like, I don't know about you, Olivia, but many things that I think we have grown from in the sport of women's wrestling, but there were still a lot of parallels between Afsoon. I thought, like, what you've experienced in high school and college, and some of the things that they're still going on within the sport. What did you think about that, Olivia? Were you able to make some parallels to some experiences that you have had?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think reading the book really does give you an appreciation for all the growth we've made over the past few decades, because we truly are in such a different place than we were back when Afsoon started wrestling. But there are still so many challenges facing women in this male dominated space today. And I think that even women and girls that haven't had much experience wrestling can relate to the way Afsoon would have felt in these spaces where she's surrounded by boys and men who often aren't supporting her and are saying harsh things and making her feel unwelcome in this space. So I think girls who wrestle have certainly felt that way. I'm sure every girl that wrestles has experienced something like that at least once. But even if you haven't competed in the sport before, it's something that's universal to almost all women, unfortunately.
Hmm. Hmm. It definitely does make for some very good conversation starters, some things that we definitely need to think about and talk about in our society, even today.
No, absolutely. And I think that's what, as I was reading through and literally tagging like each page as I was reading, I was thinking to myself, my gosh, this is perfect for putting together these questions and these guiding conversations to have not just with female wrestlers, but with all wrestlers. And
Exactly.
so, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it would be really good. One of the purposes we got the book out and made it easy for the general public to read is we really wanted to also get it into the school system and have, girls in middle school, junior high, high school, and have it be their elective reading. It one exposes more girls to the sport of wrestling, but two, my kids when they were in school at that age, they came across a book by the name of I Am Malala, and it similar to my book, was the journey and biography of Malala, who was an Afghani girl, and some of the challenges and things that she faced in Afghanistan. And of course, she wasn't a wrestler, but what she went through was very horrific, and she's definitely a success story and something for us to all learn about and see how we could improve on. And so that was the book that gave me the idea of, okay, if we are to do a book on Afsoon, that I want it to be easy read, and I do want it to get into the school system or for young readers to be able for them to kind of not only be exposed to and learn about these issues that we're going to be talking about with the inequality for women or some of the limitations women have had, and but two, again, through the sport of wrestling. And I don't think there was a book like that out there in the past. But now kids in school can use it for the nonfiction book reports. But it's definitely a good book that will generate conversation and bring up some good topics that can really apply to everybody, and a lot of girls can relate to out there.
I think also too, just considering what's going on in our world right now, Afsoon, it would be an ideal read aloud. What do you think about that, Olivia? Right? Like, how do you think students could relate to the beginning of the book Afsoon and some of the struggles that Afsoon goes through in Iran? Do you think that would resonate with students at the high school or even middle school level?
Absolutely. Like you think about what's happening in the country of Ukraine right now and all the unique and different challenges that those children are facing. It can be really hard for a high school or middle school student to relate to what's going on with the children of Ukraine and how they might be feeling. So Afsoon's book can definitely give insight into what living in a country that's been struck with war is like and can really help them maybe empathize with those people.
Right.
Yeah,
And
exactly. Just like you said, Olivia, what I experienced in Iran is almost exactly similar to, unfortunately, what is going on currently with Ukraine.
it really is. It has so many parallels. And so, then the book gets into, like you had mentioned, Afsoon, your journey here in the United States, which, interestingly enough, it's not like you were welcomed with open arms into the wrestling community. And you had mentioned some of the criticism that you had faced. And I think that is why your story is so compelling to me, because I've been sitting at wrestling matches, right, where I've seen girls wrestling boys, and perhaps the competition level is not equal, and it seems like the girl is sort of being roughed up a little bit, or it's not as competitive as you would have liked it to be, and people will sort of turn to each other in the stands, and I've been in those experiences where they'll say, like, see, like, this is not good, and this is not the way it should be. And so those have been my own personal experiences dealing with some of the criticisms, but I can't imagine how magnified that was for you as the only girl or woman really in your area that you had seen. So you had talked in the book about a lot of backlash that you had faced. And so how do you feel now, seeing that women's wrestling, girls wrestling is becoming so much more mainstreamed and supported?
Oh, honestly, I really didn't think I would see it in my lifetime. From where it started and the negativity that was surrounding it at those early years to how far it's come now, and still in my lifetime. Like I said, I'm so glad that I'm able to witness it and see it. I think when women's wrestling was debuted in the Olympics, I sat in front of that TV and I just cried tears and tears and tears of joy. That this is, it finally, it was just like, okay, it's, people are recognizing that women can wrestle and women do wrestle well and the sport is for women. And so to have seen that within those 30 years, um, how far it's come, it just, I can't tell you, it was the feeling that it gave me, but I could tell you when I was watching it at the Olympics on TV, I was just crying tears of joy because I had never thought I would see the day, and I'm glad I did.
And what kind of progress forward, Afsoon, looking ahead now, do you hope that we see for girls and women's wrestling? Maybe Olivia, you can sort of chime in here too, but like, what do we hope now? Like, yeah, we have some great progress, but are we there yet?
One of the big things that I'm really excited to see is I know in the United States, girls wrestling in high school as a high school sport is the fastest growing sport. And to see the numbers, just the growth happening gives me so much hope for the future of our girls in the sport, and that it's going to continue to the numbers to just kind of exponentially grow like that. What do you think, Olivia?
I totally agree. It's amazing to see during the state championship season this year. Felt like every single week we were adding a new state to the list of those that have sanctioned. So just that process and seeing more and more girls, and from a younger and younger age too, joining the sport of wrestling is just, it's so gratifying to see.
Mm-hmm.
Totally agreed. And so I can't help myself but drop some numbers. So as soon you mentioned the growth at the high school level. So we do have 34 states, but the goal is 50. So we're on our way that in that regard. And we did get a new NCAA program this week. Your Sinus College added women's wrestling D3 in Pennsylvania. So now we're up to 118 college programs. So we want to keep saying
And
that.
growing.
And growing. So, So I do want to share and have you guys think about some of the questions from the book guide that you really, really liked and you thought would create great conversations. But before I share exactly where you can go to look and purchase a book and look and download the book guide, maybe we can talk a little bit about how we thought about this project and why we think it's important and who could benefit from reading the book or using the book guide. Like, what is this book guide geared towards, or who is it geared towards?
Olivia, would you like to start?
I would love to. I firmly believe that absolutely everyone from all walks of life can pull something from this book guide. So for the female wrestlers, everyone can empathize with parts of Afsoon's journey. You'll see parts of your own story reflected in hers, and it's so inspiring to see someone overcome that adversity, and just reading about it can be so motivating to your own wrestling journey. And in that same light, the male wrestlers, you can have a deeper understanding for the challenges that your female friends in wrestling go through. And I think for both athletes and coaches alike, reading about that and understanding how you can better support the women on your team and in your community is really powerful knowledge to have, and will make you a great wrestling advocate in general. And then even for people who have never wrestled, there's lots of different aspects of the story that people can relate to. So you think of when Afsoon first came to the United States, it was a huge culture shock for her, and adjusting to the new language and the new culture and new people. And almost everyone has started a new job or attended a new school or been in some situation where they felt out of place and unwelcomed, and just understanding that you can overcome that discomfort and find yourself accepted. And then other examples like Afsoon's persistence, and then her resilience as she chased her goals, and then eventually her leadership as she stepped into a coaching role. There's just lots of important character traits that she exhibits both inside the sport of wrestling and in other avenues of her life that everyone can apply and learn from.
I love it, Olivia. I mean, she put it so well. I don't know how I could add to anything more to that. She's just nailed it. Thank you, Olivia. You know what I would love to see? This is like my dream, is to see a all girls wrestling tournament where in between their matches, the girl wrestlers are reading through the book, waiting for their next match, and everyone's just kind of reading the book in between, and then being able to discuss it and talk about the storylines and the issues that we talked about. So that would be really cool to see. But I think if wrestling coaches promoted it, and I do have a lot of different programs that have come and purchased the book for their wrestling teams and given it as an assigned reading. And then, they have practices, but then maybe one night in the week, they decide that instead of practice, let's give our bodies a rest and let's talk about some of these things. And, coaches have said, given me the feedback that their athletes, their wrestlers have really enjoyed something like that. And so I really now would like more than just the individual reader to see groups, whether it's book clubs or wrestling teams or, classrooms come together and read the book. And this is where the book guide comes in. It's a great tool that's already been created that can further help this.
And just listening to both of you talk, so many different groups are coming into my mind. Just how Olivia mentioned coaches, right? So I could see male and female coaches starting a group and discussing some of the challenges and successes, Afsoon, that you had later on in life. I think as you coached at the Olympics, I think also too, just having coaches read about your experience to be have some level of understanding of what female wrestlers, go through so much of the time. Any kind of athlete at any club or any high school, those athletes are forming groups. I definitely think that would be powerful and using the guide. And then parents, like I just really think that your father and mother, Afsoon, are examples and how they led and motivated you in the sport of wrestling. So certainly those are some groups that come to mind. But I'm going to put up the website here quickly where you can access the book and the book guide. And then if we can actually just head over quickly before we talk about some questions that we all like from the guide. Here's what the website looks like. So super user friendly, and a big shout out, right, Afsoon and Olivia, to Danielle.
Danielle Baker. Yes, Danielle, fellow female wrestler, fellow pioneer. And she's just, we always need super talented and super smart, but big shout out to her for creating this website for me.
Yeah, it looks great. She attached some information here, some a little podcast that you did with Jason Bryant about the book. Very easy to click on this order form here and purchase. And then, of course, the book club guide is right there for you to download. So it's definitely at your fingertips and something that we clearly are highly recommending for everyone to take a look at. So let's get into some conversation about some of the questions. So what were some examples of questions, either of you can start from the guide that you thought, well, gosh, this question or this conversation starter would clearly be something to get people talking?
Yeah, one of the ones that when I was putting together the guide really jumped out to me was Marco Sanchez had a huge impact on Afsoon's journey in sport by suggesting she try out for the wrestling team. As well, Afsoon's father played a huge role in convincing the coaches that she deserved a place in the team. Why is having strong male supporters in female sports important? And I think this just gives male wrestlers and female wrestlers and coaches alike just an opportunity to really talk about the value that men can add to women's wrestling and different ways that they can elevate the sport and support their female friends in the sport of wrestling. I think that those conversations can sometimes be difficult to initiate. So having this conversation starter to allow for that candid discussion can be really powerful.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important for male wrestlers and male coaches to also read this book and follow the guide. What you said, Olivia, is absolutely true. In my one of my speeches for the California Hall of Fame, who I really thanked also was those male wrestlers, those boys, high school wrestlers in those early years that did wrestle me, because those first years, there were so many boys that would forfeit against me and wouldn't want to wrestle me. And they would say, well, it's a no-win situation for me. The bad thing is that didn't provide me with the opportunity of getting competition or of improving. And it was those brave boys that treated me as just another wrestler and didn't look at me, oh, as that's the girl on the team, but treated me, gave me that respect as a competitor, as a fellow teammate, as a female wrestler that really wants to do the same thing that their guy wrestler friend, teammate wants to do. And that's who I really thanked, because it was from those boys that saw themselves maybe in that no-win situation, but didn't care and were able to go beyond that and know what they were doing was more important to give me that opportunity and to give me that the respect as another athlete in order for me to be able to enjoy the sport of wrestling and to grow. And that's how women's wrestling and girls wrestling has been able to grow. It's been those boys that were willing to treat us as another teammate and be our wrestling partners in the room.
That's so true. I mean, I love what you said, Afsoon, that a lot of times we say, well, it's a no-win situation for the boy, right? If he wins, it's like, oh, he took advantage of a weak woman, a girl who didn't have a lot of experience. But then if he loses, it's like, oh my gosh, you lost to a girl. So that is brave. That is totally brave for them to do. And I think one of the biggest accolades I could ever give to a male or wrestler, boy or man, is when they look at that wrestler from on the mat, staring across for them, and then they treat them just like an athlete. I've seen so many male athletes now wrestle females and then afterwards congratulate them for winning or give them some positive words of encouragement if they lost, and really I think that has come a long way. We see that more often now, which is
Exactly,
awesome.
exactly. And again, going back to the book, there's funny stories of exactly what you're talking about. And you saw my experience, and versus now seeing the experience of the current and how some of these boys are treating their fellow female competitors just as any other opponent and congratulating them, which is how it should be. Because you look at some sports like, judo or taekwondo or some of the other martial arts, and you see a lot of times women and men competing, and they have that mutual respect. They don't look at, guy doesn't look at her and go, oh, she's just a girl, she's not going to give me the same competition. And so that mindset is huge.
Agreed. All right. So what were some other questions that you guys liked from the guide that you thought would create some good conversation? I have a few in mind.
Another one of the ones that I wrote was just a really broad, important question in general. And it used the example of when Afsoon's hair length was challenged at one of the matches when one of the referees said that her hair was too long. And I believe they actually ended up cutting your hair, right, Afsoon?
Yes.
Yeah. So what are the barriers that hold back female wrestlers today? Because obviously we see lots of girls with long hair now, and that's not really a challenge girls are really presented with anymore. But there's tons of different and new barriers that maybe didn't exist in Afsoon's time that are now issues, especially as girls wrestling further develops. So I think that's a great topic of conversation for all athletes to discuss.
Oh my gosh, that one is going to get a lot of conversation going because I do. It's so funny. I don't know, 2 years ago, I remember being in a room, maybe not even 2 years ago. And there were men in the room and some women who hadn't been around the sport of wrestling and couldn't fathom the fact that we didn't need hair nets or whatever it was to cover hair and keep it back. I was trying to explain them, well, in freestyle wrestling, we don't have any of that. And it's okay. No one's hair gets pulled out. There's no blood everywhere. And so there really are some interesting stories I think people will love to share and relate to. So I think just in general, right, Olivia, we have to talk about lowering the barriers to entry for the sport of wrestling. We make it easier for women to want to come onto the mat. And I could see the topic of conversation maybe even going to singlets, when we're talking about the hair and some of those barriers to entry.
Absolutely. I think in this era of social media, there's a whole different genre of challenges that women face in relation to the sport of wrestling, with everything just being portrayed online differently now. Some girls may, obviously, social media can be super positive in educating girls about women's wrestling and the visibility of wrestling, but I think that just adds a whole different level of complexity to issues like this.
Mm-hmm.
Without a doubt. Afsoon, did you have any questions that stuck out to you? I have a couple I want to share, like I said, but I want to give you the
I want to
opportunity.
hear you guys because, of course, it's the book. It's my story, but it's really intriguing to me to see your perspectives on it and what questions that you have come up with that will be these great conversation starters. And my time versus the challenges today, and the things that we're talking about today. So, Lori, I would love to hear what your thoughts were.
Well, I'm thinking a lot about coaching these days, right? And so hoping that we can start that pipeline of female coaches. So the fact that you you weren't able to hit that first Olympic team, and then the years didn't work out with you timeline wise, but that you started a family and then you wanted to get back into the sport of wrestling. So the question that stuck out to me that I would love to have a conversation about, when I start my book club is, after having her first son, Afsoon was eager to get back into wrestling from a coaching leadership perspective, but she soon realized how challenging that would be with a small baby at home. So are we doing enough to support options for women with young children to stay involved with the sport? And that was important to me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. And I know a few female coaches out there in the state of California that have actually come across that challenge. When they've had young babies, and one particular female coach I have so much respect for, and she's a phenomenal coach. And I remember when she first had her little ones, and she was coaching at the state championships, and she had her baby in one of those baby Bajorns, and they kicked her off the mat. They would not allow her to be in the corner of the mat because she had her baby. And there was no danger to the baby. She's in the corner. There's the wrestling mat, the circle's out there, and she's able to still coach. And I think she had, her assistant coach with her as well. But she had to really fight that. And it took a few years for them to change the rules to be able to be more supportive and being able to allow female coaches more. So, and I'll tell you, I'll give a shout out to Terry Steiner, who's the national team coach. He created an environment that allowed for female athletes to be able to bring their young ones and still be able to compete. And even him as a coach, him and his spouse, she traveled a lot. She's an airline attendant, and so she would be gone at a lot of times where he had to be the primary caregiver for their child when she was young. And he would create that environment where it was family friendly, and he would have his daughter at the wrestling practices, and seeing, again, setting that role model, setting that as an example that, okay, maybe it's not what you've been used to all these years, but it's the sign of the times change. You see more primary caregivers being, whether it's moms or dads, and we're just needing to create more family friendly environments, whether that's in a work environment or an elite athlete environment or wrestling. And so there really isn't a reason that just because you became a young mom or a young dad, or just because you've had a baby, that you can't get back to your, even as an athlete competing, or as a coach coaching. Yeah, absolutely. But how do we provide that support group, and how do we change that culture that this is a family friendly environment, and you can still get the job done and get it done well with a baby?
Right.
And a family.
I remember that story. And speaking of Terry Steiner, and I'm going to let you, Olivia, share another question here. Sorry, I'm just excited about it. We have a question about Terry Steiner that Olivia put into the guide. Terry Steiner took the time to get to know Afsoon. He showed her the utmost respect and worked to make sure that senior level women knew her story. Why is it important that we educate young wrestlers on the history of our sport? Are we doing enough to make sure everyone knows this history? So that's another way to create conversation, right? Around.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is so important. I think Andrea Yamamoto and John Fulp said a quote that I cannot be what I don't see, and basically it's about role models, right? And so Terry Steiner really recognized the fact that our current senior female athletes, world athletes, need to know that there is a history and that there were other women that were in that same position and were successful, and maybe this is how they did it, and this is part of the history, because that's how we grow, and that's how we build on, and that's how we improve. And a big part of that is having role models and seeing other women that have done it and done it well, and then we can use those as role models. And so that's what's so important. What I tell the current generation of high school female wrestlers, I say, yes, you're my legacy, but you are also the role models for the next generation of female wrestlers and girl wrestlers.
Amen to that. I love it. Olivia, all right, I'm going to let you share a question here, Olivia. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. This is the last question that I had identified as one that really jumped out to me. It took Manu, Afsoon's father, months of traveling to different countries across Europe to get a visa. He had to be very persistent despite repeated denials from the passport agents. What ways do you show persistence and resilience in wrestling? So I think this question is so important because it really captures kind of the essence of the book from the standpoint of what you can apply to your own life. And I think this question will really resonate with, the athletes who maybe are reading this in the middle of their season and, they're in the competition grind. And it just reminds you of the important things that you take away from wrestling and how it can be extrapolated to different areas of your life. I think it's a really good way for athletes to recognize the things that they're doing that are going to carry over to other avenues of their life.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, Olivia, you totally hit it the nail on the head, because we always say wrestling is such a tough sport and it's like a fight, and life is like a fight. There's so many times in life that there's been obstacles, that's been hardships, that you feel like you're down, and to find that resiliency, to find that fight in order to overcome those obstacles, it's like a wrestling match. And that's why it's so important for women to have that same opportunity to enjoy this great sport just as men and boys do, is because wrestling really teaches those life lessons. Wrestling is one of the only sports that where you're really out there on your own. It's a one-on-one sport. And it is like a battle. It is like a challenge. It is like a fight, just like it is when you're going through your life battles, your life fights. And so I can't tell you how many times the sport of wrestling has helped me in those battles. And just like you said, what my father went through with his persistence, I really think the reason he was able to persist and persevere was because he was a wrestler. And he had those experiences of being a wrestler and being able to fight and overcome those challenges, and really being a fighter. That's what wrestling develops, and that's the kind of individual that wrestling develops. And you can use what you've learned in the sport of wrestling to really apply to all the challenges and difficulties and hardships that are thrown at you in life, and being able to overcome them.
Perfectly said. Perfectly said.
And you had talked a little bit before, Afsoon, about having role models in the sport of wrestling. And so there's questions in there in the book guide too. You talk about idolizing John Smith in the book when you were in high school and some experiences you had. practicing with him, right? That probably to you was like mind blowing, and to him was like,
Yeah.
what just happened? I don't even remember that.
To be honest, I've never talked to John Smith about this. I don't know if he recalls that, if he remembers that. Of course, to me, it was one of the biggest epic moments of my life. Oh my gosh, John Smith. I think I probably didn't wash my hands a week after that, because I was like, oh my gosh, John Smith, I got to. But you know what? He was one of the first wrestlers that even back then treated me as just another wrestler, another workout partner. He set the example that he didn't look at me as, oh, who is this girl? She's not going to be a good workout partner for me. In fact, the opposite. Here's this Olympic gold medalist. Here's this legend in our sport. And even back in the 80s, he's coming up to me and going, hey, I need a workout partner. You seem like you know how to wrestle. And he really looked at me just as another wrestler. And that was such a huge moment. And again, what he did was such a forward thinker, and this was 30 years ago. So yeah, I mean, he's my hero.
Well, we hope that John Smith keeps pushing forward with women's wrestling, and he adds a program down at Oklahoma State. That would be fantastic. So
yes,
if John's listening, let's make that happen. No, so we could go on and back and forth. There's just really this are just an example of all the questions and all the great conversation starters that are included in the guide, because the book is amazing. So again, the title of the book is Afsoon by Craig Sesker, and it's just really a rich read. But Afsoon points out it's not a difficult read, so really it is for everyone to be able to enjoy. So definitely pick up a copy. The website is up there. And before I let you ladies go, I do have a question for you. So I'm always looking for ideas for the Everything Women's Wrestling show. This is our show, right? We want to be educating. We want to be growing the sport of wrestling. And so I'm looking for some advice from you on what topics we should be covering on the show, what guests maybe we should be bringing onto the show. What do you guys think? What's your input there?
You know what I would love to see? The opposite of what I've gone through, right? Because I was one of the pioneers of women's wrestling, one of the grandmas really of women's wrestling. But I would love to see, as one of your guests in the future, a young girl wrestler, someone that's going through it maybe as a, first year or second year, young, maybe 7, 8 year old girl wrestler, and kind of seeing what her experiences are, and how she thinks of wrestling, and how she enjoys wrestling. And then maybe also another guest that it may be a little bit older, a preteen, just kind of the younger generation. I would love to see what this younger generation of girl wrestlers, what they think and how they, and are enjoying the sport, and what feedback they have. I would love to hear from them and their perspective.
Well, thank goodness, because of all your work, Afsoon, their journey is hopefully, different and much more positive. So I think that's a great idea. I love it.
I have 2 ideas for you, Lori. The first guest that I would suggest is the queen herself, Adeline Gray. I've listened to so many of her interviews, and I think she's a fantastic advocate for the sport of women's wrestling. Hearing her perspective on things such as, are the weight classes in women's wrestling inclusive enough? Do we offer girls the support and information they need to wrestle while they're going through puberty, and the different resources that can help them during that transition? And now she's pregnant with twins, so I'm sure she's going to have a fantastic perspective about being a mother in sport and being an elite athlete. So I think she'd be a super powerful guest to have on the show. And then the second topic I was thinking about is something that's been a really hot button issue in men's wrestling lately, and that's NIL money. You think of a lot of the top male NCAA athletes, and they have tons of different sponsorship deals, which is fantastic. Athletes should absolutely be paid, but how can we give female athletes these same opportunities? And I'm not really sure what guests would be able to provide those answers, but I think that's something as a wrestling community that we should really be thinking about.
Absolutely, Olivia. I mean, some of those deals are interesting, and I think they're just beginning to unfold. And we're having coaches having a whole new topic of learning, really, when it comes to recruiting and retaining athletes. And so, how does that affect the female wrestlers as well? So great idea, absolutely wonderful. I think we're all trying to wrap our head around how this is going to affect sports, and so to continue the conversation and to discuss how it affects women's wrestling. Terrific suggestion. And Adeline Gray, I just spent 2 days with her in Colorado. She's part of the committee to advance women's wrestling. And so perfect suggestion if she would be willing to come on. And certainly now with her expanding belly, she is becoming more and more, not that she wasn't adorable already, but more and more adorable as the days tick on. So I just have to thank both of you so much for taking the time to talk today and for working together on this project. Is there anything else that before I let you go that we haven't touched on that you want to share?
I think that covered it. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this project. And just to everyone listening, I fully recommend reading the book and participating in these conversations because there's a lot of meaningful growth that can come out of this.
Yeah, Lori, thank you so much for having us on and for thinking of this project, and just brilliant. And thank you for all that you do for women's wrestling.
Oh, fantastic. My pleasure. And so everyone listening, make sure that you go to the website, afsoonwrestling.com, purchase the book and download the book guide and get these conversations going, and share a little bit on social media about some of the different groups that you're putting together. Send Afsoon a message, and we'll continue to have these great conversations. So thanks, ladies. Have a great night.
Thank you.